I know you're all here to see me and not the Lord of the Rings, so let's get started. My name is Katrina King, and I lead strategy globally for content production at AWS. And I'm joined today by Ron Ames, who's one of the producers of The Lord of the Rings of Power, and Wei-Ren Henriks, who is the Senior Vice President of Product Development at Company 3. And so today I'm going to give you a little overview of content production for AWS and walk through some best practices and our holistic strategy surrounding moving content production workloads to the cloud. Then we're going to do a bit of a technical deep dive of some of the things that we've released this year. And then what you are all waiting for, The Lord of the Rings of Power, and followed up by Company 3 and their work on the show. So here at AWS, media and entertainment is organized surrounding 5 solutions areas. And the solution areas are content production, media supply chain and archive, broadcast, direct-to-consumer, and data science and analytics for media and entertainment. And each one of these solutions areas is led by what we call an Industry Innovation Center. And the Industry Innovation Center's role is to expand the art of the real for workloads on AWS. And I happen to lead our content production Industry Innovation Center, which is why you're stuck with me today. So talking through some trends that we're seeing in content production. Distributed production, no better example being The Lord of the Rings of Power, with artists all over the world. But those sorts of workloads and distributed workforces require global orchestration. And that's where things like Company 3's Synapse platform comes in. And then finally, all of the above creates operational efficiencies that stem from process and technical efficiencies as well. So some of the reasons that we migrate content production workloads to AWS, we have the most functionality. And that includes our creative tools like Deadline, Nimble Studio, things like Elemental Media Connect, which we're now using for our Color in the Cloud pipeline. We have the fastest pace of innovation. We've released over 3,000 notable features and services in the last year. We have the most proven operational expertise. We've been doing this a while, as you all know. We're the most secure, supporting 98 security and compliance certificates, including industry-specific things like the Motion Picture Association's Trusted Partner Network and the Content Delivery and Security Alliance. And finally, we have the largest community of customers and partners. We now have twice as many regions as the nearest cloud, enabling unprecedented access to the global talent pool. We now have 21 local zones with 30 more coming internationally, and that enables single-digit millisecond latency for artists all over the world. And we have 8 new regions coming. And this is why media and entertainment customers are choosing AWS. So I want to talk a little bit about our holistic vision for content production. It all really starts with the Studio Content Lake. And this is leveraging Amazon's Simple Storage service to store your original camera files in the cloud. Then partner solutions to facilitate the population of that content lake, things like Cumulo, Weka, Pixit. And then, but AWS shouldn't just be viewed as underlying infrastructure. Start to view it as an orchestration layer that can really bring and weave all of the different facets of a workflow together, really creating something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. And that's only possible if we reduce data silos, improve interoperability, and eliminate proprietary channels that preclude agnostic interoperability. So here is a dramatically oversimplified version of a post-production timeline. We all know things are a little bit more complicated and a little bit more asynchronous than this today. But back in the day, physical objects like reels of film needed to travel. And today, that really hasn't changed that much if you think about it. We now move isolons in trucks rather than cans of film. So what does this timeline look like when you introduce the concept of a studio content lake? It blooms. And it looks like a flower, or in Elvish, a loth, as in Lothlorien or Lothloriel. See what I did there? And so here, we ingest our original camera files straight to the cloud. And then those are pulled for editorial, and things like an AAF is returned to the Studio Content Lake. We can then leverage things like API-driven transcoding, which can access that content lake and then return the transcoded files to it. So then we can also orchestrate VFX pulls, VFX returns. Original camera files and AAFs can be pulled for color conforming and mastering, and then the final master can be returned. We can then view it in something like a production asset management system. And all of these things integrate with the core studio architecture. Here's another way of looking at it. So I showed this last year, I think in this exact same room. And so what we're looking at here is kind of a more expanded version of that vision, with the central circle being the studio content lake. And like I started, this is your original camera files living in simple storage service. The next ring out are core production and post-production workloads. And those run on EC2 instances, Elastic Compute instances. And that's things like your offline editorial, VFX, your render farm. And it doesn't really matter where those instances live, in your account, in a creative service provider's account, in the studio account. As long as that MovieLabs 2030 tenet, that applications come to the content, holds true, then it works. The next ring out are third-party SaaS solutions, independent software vendors, AWS partners, and these are things like telestream transcoding, that API-driven transcoding I was talking about a second ago. These are things like your applications running on those Elastic Compute instances, things like your QC, your production asset management system. And what you'll notice about most of the partners that were selected for this particular slide is that these are partners that really exemplify that interoperability and agnostic interconnectivity. So this is really cool. We actually built this at IBC this year. And big shout out to Brandon Lindauer, who's in the crowd, for leading that project. And we wanted to build an actual manifestation of this holistic vision, and we did. And so we built a single virtual private cloud, and in it we hosted all of our post-production workloads. And it started with rapid camera ingest. And to do that, we used a jellyfish device, which is capable of high throughput. And we did that leveraging a company called Packet Fabric. And Packet Fabric offers width as a service. So they'll lay dark fiber to a sound stage. And then a show will come in and say, okay, I have 35 terabytes of dailies a day. I'm going to need 10 gigabits a second to be able to get those into the cloud. And then Packet Fabric will lease them that bandwidth for run of show. So that allows us to get everything pushed up to Amazon S3. From S3, a Lambda function was triggered that pushed that media to a Pixit store that we used to all of the other workloads accessed from the same central storage. And so we started off with pre-visualization in Unreal, running on a G5 instance. And then those plates were returned to our central store. For editorial, we used Adobe Premiere, and that was running on a G4DN instance. For VFX, we were running Flame. For color and finish, we were running Baselight. And for quality control, we were running ColorFront. And so a couple of really cool things that we did here. All of these workloads were interconnected using Moxion. So from our Moxion terminal, you were able to have an over-the-shoulder view of what every single artist on your production was doing. So for Unreal, we leveraged NDI out to be able to move into a Moxion relay server. For Premiere, Premiere has a native Streambox integration. As a native Streambox integration, but we also used NDI coming out of there to move into the Moxion relay server as well. For VFX, for Flame, we used CDI, and then Media Connect forked the signal off and sent an RTMP signal to Moxion as well. We did something very similar for Baselight, running on a G4 instance. And then, so we had all of these individual workloads interconnected to Moxion, so our director could sit there and see what every single artist was doing. And not only that, they could see down the barrel of the lens of the camera using QTake integration that we leveraged as well. But it didn't stop there. The other really cool thing that we did here was we connected a reference monitor to every single one of these workloads. I don't think anybody's ever done that before. We did it using multiple different methods that I'm going to walk through in a second. So we had reference grade monitoring for every single one of these workloads, for our previs workflow, for our editorial workflow, for our VFX workflow, color and finishing, and for master QC, every single one of these. And when MovieLabs saw what we were doing, they allowed us to put up a sign that claimed that we had, well, Sol 4 is putting it a little bit too much. We're still a long way from 2030, but they acknowledged that the case study demonstrated principles 1, 2, 3, 6, and 10. So principle 1, applications are ingested straight to the cloud through our Jellyfish and our Packet Fabric integration. Principle 2, applications come to the media. Well, that's pretty much all of those workloads. Principle 3, propagation and distribution of assets is a publish function. Not only did we leverage Lambda to be able to move media around, but we leveraged some of the functionality of Moxion to be able to orchestrate things like AAF files for conform. Principle 6, every individual is authenticated. Everything was centrally authenticated. And then Principle 10, workflows are designed around real-time iteration and feedback. And that was where we were leveraging our Moxion integration with all of these individual workloads. And the really cool thing about this entire environment is that it was all fronted by Arch Platform. So Arch Platform, if you don't know, is a studio in the cloud management system that allows you to really easily spin up a studio. It allows you to assign artists to workstations, launch workstations, destroy workstations. It can even manage storage. And so all of our entire environment was within a single VPC, and that VPC was managed by our Arch Platform. So diving a little deeper into our reference monitoring. So there's three different ways that we did it, and we weren't even limited to a single method for each of these. The first is in-application encoding. So this, for instance, is our ColorFront QC build, which was feeding a Blackmagic design decklink. And then for our third-party encode decode, this is, as an example, NDI coming out of the Unreal Engine to Streambox, and then Streambox feeding it over to their device on set with a reference monitor attached. And then finally, for mathematically lossless encoding, we have our Color in the Cloud pipeline that just won the Hollywood Professional Association's Engineering Excellence Award. And so what we did here is we integrated Cloud Digital Interface into Baselight. And Cloud Digital Interface is a protocol for moving uncompressed video within the AWS cloud. And that allows us to move picture straight from the frame buffer to a managed service, in this case, Elemental Media Connect. That allows us to offload all computational overhead from the artist experience. So the instance itself is dedicated 100% to artist performance. And then finally, Media Connect feeds the signal over JPEG Access over SMPTE standard 2110-22 to an on-prem decoder box, an IP-based JPEG Access decoder, and we have a partnership with Riddell and Evertz in order to be able to make that happen. So Color in the Cloud is just one of many myriad of reasons that AWS continues to lead in content production and makes us the preferred choice of media and entertainment workloads. And so I've spoken enough. I know you're all here. I know what we're all here to see. So without further ado, let me introduce Ron Ames, producer of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power.
Thank you, Katrina.
When I think of Tolkien, I think of the vastness of his imagination and the depth of the world he created. And when it comes to taking you to another world that is fully imagined, this is about the greatest piece of material you could ever work on.
Tolkien has this amazing ability to both make you feel like a child who is experiencing something important, but also as an adult who is experiencing something filled with wonder. You feel that you are touching something higher.
There is something universal in this material. The Second Age is all about isolation and alliance. And it's all about cultures colliding with one another and facing change that they can't stop. I think those are universals that would speak across time, but I humbly suggest could speak to this time as well.
There's a mysterious process of finding unity with your collaborators where you feel the orchestra coming into harmony. And whether that's on a story beat, whether that's with a line of dialogue, whether it's the color of somebody's dress or somebody's armor, it knows what it wants to be.
And action!
Tolkien himself said that he hopes that it will be the creation of sort of a larger mythos for other artists and other hands.
This is not a TV show. This is not a movie. This is something new. And we can't wait to welcome everyone back to Middle-earth.
Good morning. My name is Ron Ames, and I have the great good fortune of being one of the producers on season 1 of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. And I'm going to start my talk actually at the end because I want to make sure that I said the most important things first. First of all, I'd like to thank Katrina and her team and the people at AWS who are actually creating the future of filmmaking. The future of filmmaking is cloud-based production, and the technology that we explored and is continuing to be built and made practical. I want to thank Gretchen Libby and her team in MNE at AWS. And I wanted to thank some of the folks at Amazon Prime who believed in our production and our production technology from the very beginning. Christina Aguilar, Keith Ridlop, Josh Griswold, Chris Del Conte from Visual Effects at Amazon Prime, Rebecca Moon at post-production, and my friend Jesse Kobayashi, who was with me from the beginning, creating this pipeline. And most of all, I want to thank our executive producer, Lindsay Weber, who hired me to begin with the curious idea that I would be able to manage and produce all of the technical departments from pre-visualization to exhibition, meaning all of the technical trades, camera capture, color pipeline, editorial, post-production, visual effects, exhibition, by that final archive and delivery to platform would be connected and, as Katrina was talking about, interconnected. And that was the key. And the power of this is about art making. This is not about technology as a standalone thing. It is actually practical. It is useful. It is efficient. When we're on set and a director is chasing the light and we must go, and it's dirty and it's cold, and we have every possible asset at our fingertips and can share. When we had crews spread across New Zealand, a studio in Los Angeles, artists all over the world, we were able to connect, communicate, efficiently scale as necessary, and meet all of our goals and deadlines cost efficiently and in a united manner. It is truly powerful, and it's filmmaking and it's art making. And I worked on a film called The Aviator, and at the end of that movie, Leonardo DiCaprio, who's playing Howard Hughes, is standing in front of the mirror, and he's looking at himself and he's saying, "The wave of the future, the wave of the future, the wave of the future." That's what we did every single day. We knew that this is the wave of the future, and the future is now. So when we talk about MovieLab 2030, it's right now. It's doable, and it's actionable, and it is useful. So I wanted to start with that, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the show. So in 2019, the other people I need to really thank are the creators of the show, Patrick and JD, who were our creative guides and believed in the technology and allowed it to help them imagine the craziest things. So in 2019, we started in Los Angeles in an office, and the writer's room was down the hall, and our production office, which was 4 or 5 of us, Jake Rice and Jason Smith, and then Jesse joined us. And we would sit there, and they would come out of the writer's room and give us outlines of this fantastic story. And we would look at each other, and our jaws would drop and go, how are we going to do that? It was fantastic creatures. It was scale using motion capture and motion computerized cameras on set as a first unit tool, virtual production of all kinds. And we looked at each other and said, how can we do this? This is big. This is too big for the tools we have. We're going to be in New Zealand. How are we going to actually achieve this? So this bigness, and it wasn't bigness for the sake of big, it was bigness because Tolkien created big worlds. So we knew that big was our story. So what we discovered by the end is that we had 786 hours of 4K camera dailies, all of it at 4K UHD. We had 9,164 visual effects across the 8 episodes. That is the equivalent of 4 feature films, the size of Avengers, Age of Ultron, or the first Avatar. Some of the big movies that I've worked on, those are singular 2-hour, 1,500 to 2,000 shot shows, which are huge. This was 9,000 visual effects across 8 hours of theatrical quality film. How were we going to do that? We had no idea. We wound up using 1,500 artists. We scaled to 1,500 artists all across the world. That's not including the artists that we had in New Zealand. We had hundreds of artists in New Zealand. Our crew in New Zealand at the wrap party was 1,700 people. And all of these people had to hear the story and get the scripts delivered and all the rest of it. We had 12 global vendors for visual effects of various sizes. These vendors were, and they all had different pipelines, and they were all spread over the world. And the price of admission to join us was a willingness to explore new technology, to share assets in a standard way so that nobody could put a gadget or a gizmo on a visual effect that somebody else couldn't use that asset. So by creating a standard and everybody leaning in together, we determined that we could actually do this. And it was all for one and one for all. Tolkien says that when he started to write the Silmarillion and create the world of Middle-earth, that he wisely started with a map and made the story fit. The other way around lands one in confusions and impossibilities, and in any case, it's weary work to compose a map from a story. So we started with a map also. We recognized that we were going to have to plan this very carefully, and so we moved to New Zealand and we started to build our pipeline. And we built a cloud production map, how we were going to do things. And we were there for prep, and we started to shoot. And 3 months in, March 2020, and COVID hit. And we were told that we had to shut down. That weekend, we took all of our hardware, sent it out to our teams, and said we were not going to shut down. We couldn't shut down. If we shut down, we would lose our vendors, we would lose our staffs, we would lose all these artists we had collected around the world. We had to continue. Visual effects, post-production, because we had already shot episode 1 and 2, had to continue. We weren't going to stop. And so over the weekend, we sent all the work, all the computers and all the tools home to the teams, and we started cloud-based production in earnest. We were doing it anyway, but this made it a requirement and sent us to the next level of development. And we came up with 3. So there was lots of learning. It was all the technical learning and all the things I was describing, but there was more. There was values that began to become identified. One was metadata. The importance of metadata from beginning till end, and I'll talk more about that. Also, collaboration and the interconnectedness of film production and the dynamic constant changing that Katrina was talking about, that goes on from moment to moment. I'll talk about how we dealt with that. And then finally, asset management as workflow, the importance of assets. And again, we think of these things as dry, technical things. They're not. They're art making. Underlying all of this is thoughts, snippets, what JD was talking about, a note of music, a line of dialogue. Every one of those are a potential asset. So I'm going to continue on to centralized metadata. So metadata is a term, when I started in the film business, metadata was described by edge code on negative film and typed script notes and a call sheet and production report. That was the extent of metadata. Now every single frame has every piece of content that went into making that frame that rides along with that, that frame from beginning till end. For creation, for all kinds of purposes we don't even know yet. We're using metadata in ways we never, when we started our production, dreamed of using. So on set, we collected metadata in a very unique way. Each department had their own iPad. Each department had their own software that fed into QTake and then was injected into, using Moxion, into every frame. And then from that point on, it was never lost. The metadata stayed with the shot all the way through the end, through Avid, through editorial, through sound mixing. We could always identify the nature of that frame, where it came from, and how it was connected to the rest of it. Okay. On set, we used automation, area smart lenses fed to our camera, and that was injected into the headers. As I described, the on-set personnel and the collection of metadata in unique forms where each department was only interested in the things they were interested. Usually what happens is there is overlap. So we will look at the metadata and it says, oh, it was a 25 millimeter lens. Another will say, no, it was a 19 millimeter lens. At that point, the information is useless. It's a Tower of Babel. This way, and the way we did it with each department only caring for the metadata that was important to them, we knew the information was accurate, and the things that could be collected automatically were collected automatically. And then all of this information was published using Moxion and then put into ShotGrid and shared. Again, all cloud-based. We had spinning disks on the ground, but we had no LTO, tape backups. We had nothing but spinning disks to get this information into the cloud, and we put it in S3 buckets. Now, I call this slide buckets and buckets and buckets. We started with no idea how to do this, so we overbuilt everything. We were actually concerned that we would lose data, or that somehow or other it might be corrupt because there's no checksum. None of the usual ways, so we were backing things up to LTO. But what we discovered was none of that was required. One bucket to rule them all, with push and pull permissions. Maybe two for latency purposes geographically is all that's necessary. We doubled and tripled our data because we had never done it before. But by the end, we had total faith. We never lost a frame. We never lost an asset. All of it was trackable and easily shared with our vendors. And all the technological companies that worked with us, from simple post-production companies, Avid, from all of the AWS companies, everybody was willing to play and discover these tools and help us to figure out how to do this. In fact, Wayron, who's going to talk next, I called him a year in and said, Wayron, I need you to take all of our camera raw, put it in the cloud. We never want to touch it. We want to do every function required for visual effects, for conform, for final mix, for everything, and placing it back into platform in the cloud. Will you help us do that? And Wayron said yes. So he'll tell you about his part of it. But it actually worked. 9 months later, we had a working system that was totally reliable. Collaborative production. So something unique has happened in the film business, and partly it's the great goodness of digital media. So we have digital media stored in ways that are built behind silos for protection, for security, for various reasons. And what happens is it keeps us from collaborating. With cloud-based production, we can break down those barriers and with permissions, share whatever is necessary. We didn't have paper scripts. Nothing was kept in any form other than digitally and could be shared immediately on iPads. And during when COVID hit and we had to have, and we went back to the stages, we had to be separated. So we put monitors all around. We had a network. It was like a television streaming. All of our units, and we had sometimes 3 units shooting at one time, could all collaborate from afar using iPads and Moxion streaming to networks, all cloud-based and all controllable. Every iPad, we could see their name and turn it on or turn it off as required. The other thing that I think is an important value and something to remember in modern filmmaking is that filmmaking is no longer, if it ever was, a linear process. It's dynamic. When we start with script, marketing begins at that very moment. Marketing isn't something that's done at the end. Concepting is happening from the very beginning. Film production and testing is happening from the very beginning. All of these materials are being created and shared, concept art, set drawings. All of these tests and materials are being created dynamically and shared amongst each other. And with the ability to share in this democratic way, easily, it changes everything. The power, I cannot describe the power of it. Walking onto a set and having a cut, having a diagram, having a note from the showrunners. Anything that was necessary was available at all times at a push of a button, securely, with permissions. The next thing I want to talk about are assets. Assets sound so dry. They sound like something that you have at the end. It's something that, oh yes, we need to gather all of this. To me, an asset is at the heart of art making. An asset starts when an artist sits down and begins to draw, or a writer writes a line, or a musician creates a theme or a note. All of these are assets, nascent assets, that need to be protected. Once they become published, though, now they're an asset that needs to be consumed, used, and we never know it's important. We don't know what an important asset is. We think maybe a drawing by John Howe of a fantastic creature may someday be of value even though it wasn't used. Or really, you can't tell what's important. So all assets need to be protected, shared, and held in a way that is useful, tagged, and tracked. So by the end, our system was able to, I could turn to Jesse and say, please put in red-headed dwarf. At the end of that would come up every asset having to do with King Durin III, a set drawing, a beard layout, a costume note. All of that could be found and tracked easily and shared. So with that, with everything on AWS, we could track and share all of that seamlessly. And as we went into post, this is an important one. We created a unified, I mentioned this before, digital asset, common asset methodology using USD. And this was created by ILM and Weta working together to create a methodology of keeping 3D objects with a QuickTime so anyone can look at it. You can look at every one of our assets and know precisely what it is, and it could be shared with any other vendor easily, which we did all the time. And no vendor could get into trouble. Archive is another thing that is really important and important to me. I worked with Martin Scorsese on a couple of restorations. One was The Red Shoes, the other was Gangs of New York. And when we opened the Red Shoes footage that was nitrate film and was melting in the can, it was heartbreaking. There was no way that this material would have been kept for any longer. So we restored it, we painstakingly created new digital negatives. When I went to restore Gangs of New York, which was a modern film, and I asked for the answer prints, there were 3 answer prints, and no one, including Marty, knew what the color was supposed to look like. That is no longer a requirement. We now have the methodology of keeping assets forever in the cloud, whether we put it in Glacier, with color information, with everything that is required. LTO tape is, have you ever tried to restore something from LTO tape? It's near impossible. I think we believe that we're backing things up. I don't believe that in actuality we are. And I think the other thing that's important about archive is at the end of the process, when we were done shooting, we were wrapped. It wasn't weeks and months of putting things together. We put down that work, and season 2 began, and they had every single piece of artwork that we had created, every piece of cut footage, music, sound, concept art, all at their fingertips, easily tracked, easily shared. And then the last thing was our final delivery was done using virtual machines. So Jesse and I could be in our homes, and we could be moving giant files. We'd spin up a virtual machine and be able to move giant files onto platform through QC, through all of the localization that needed to be done with languages all over the world. It was truly incredible. And I just wanted to acknowledge this list of faces and names. These are the people that were with me in New Zealand, but behind these people, there were men and women who have made films in traditional methodologies their whole life, and they were introduced to this new methodology, and every single one of them adopted it, enjoyed it, and actually are now modern filmmakers. This is the wave of the future, and it's people making art that's important. The technology is in support of art making and communication. And as Andy Serkis taught me, it is the performance. It is people dancing in front of a fire, communicating human interest. That is what makes technology wholesome and helps us to create art into the future. So before I leave, I'm just going to acknowledge Wayron and our 4K color pipeline that he's going to talk about. But we were able to create our color. We were in New Zealand watching a reference monitor, as Katrina was talking about. Our colorist was in Idaho, and we would, in real time, watch the color just as if we were in the room with him. And all the files were cloud-based, no local files anywhere. And with that, thank you guys for listening. It was a pleasure, and I could talk about this forever. I think this is the coolest thing. Thank you for listening.
At last, our days of war are over. Today, our days of peace begin.
We thought our joys would be unending. We thought our light would never dim. But we never imagined our world was about to descend into shadow. Evil does not sleep. It waits. And in the moment of our complacency, it blinds us.
Straight to the Southland! Straight to the Southland!
One day this will be your kingdom.
When all this is ended,
Elves will take orders from us.
We can't survive this! Without friends, what are we surviving for?
Half of us just left, but half stayed. So lift your aim.
Nothing is evil in the beginning.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Katrina. My name is Wayron Henricks. I'm SVP of Product Development at Company 3. Working on the Rings of Power was quite an adventure, a good adventure. As Ron mentioned, the complexity and the magnitude of this task was monumental. But the palette of tools available to us in AWS allowed us to integrate technologies from Company 3, seamlessly arriving at solutions in a timely manner and solving all the unknowns of this magnitude of task. I'm going to talk about Synapse and Cloud Studio, Company 3's innovations that we use on the Rings of Power. But before that, what is Company 3? Company 3 is a premier artist-led creative company driven by technology and innovation. We are located in Santa Monica, Hollywood, New York, London, Atlanta, Toronto, Vancouver, and AWS. AWS lets us be anywhere through our infrastructure as code in all their regions, as well as we like to think of AWS as a fabric that ties all our different facilities into a cohesive power of creativity. At the same time, it lets us function, each facility function individually or independently. And this dance of combined global as well as individual effort gives us a very remarkable advantage. So we specialize in all aspects of post-production with services in feature film, episodics, documentaries, and commercials. Company 3 and the Rings of Power, a little bit more detail on that. So Company 3 built the whole post-production environment in the cloud under the leadership of our CTO, Robert Keske. The post-production studio basically ingests camera raw metadata, the whole gamut of image science, VFX pools, returns, conform, finishing, and deliverables. I'm going to get into a little bit more details in that. We are located in US West, US East, AP Southeast, and EU West, and we could expand into any region through our infrastructure as code. And the whole infrastructure, the instances that we use are all GPU, CPU, storage, networking, and of course, database and security. Essentially, we took the traditional facility in a way and put it into the cloud, including the entire gamut of post-production. Now, on the finishing side, we also have HDR and SDR reference. This is high quality streaming, as Katrina was talking about in the beginning. And we used the whole technology to collaborate on the show, as Ron was indicating, with colorists in Idaho and Conform in the US West, LA, New York, Auckland, and London. So now, a little bit deeper dive into the specific technologies, Synapse and the Cloud Studio. But first, let's play the video, please.
Modern projects use capture technology that we couldn't even have dreamt of just a few years ago. 2K, 4K, 8K, well-captured images that take your breath away. But the real power is invisible. It's the metadata. Synapse is a workflow automation system for post-production. The concept of Synapse is to provide uniform, high-quality content to downstream post-production pipelines from the chaos of modern production, where every project is unique. On modern productions, many camera platforms are used with multivariate color spaces, picture geometries, and metadata formats. Dailies ingests all the on-set capture, syncs the sound with picture, checks the quality of what was shot, and makes QuickTimes for editorial. Synapse automatically and continuously ingests all the metadata from dailies. AWS Direct Connect powers that continuous flow of metadata and removes the restrictions of location. Synapse agents are machines or VMs that automatically harvest and cross-check metadata. They also process, render, and move show data. Synapse intelligently connects the metadata to all of the camera source files. This allows Synapse to quickly create editorial, visual effects, and finishing deliverables with correct color and geometry. We've looked at the why of Synapse and briefly at the how. Now let's take a 30,000-foot look at a Synapse AWS workflow. This one used on a recent major project that spanned the globe. On-set production. On this project, on-set and dailies were in Auckland, with Conform in Sydney. Dailies uploads camera raw and metadata to Sydney AWS bucket. Synapse harvests camera raw and metadata from the AWS bucket and builds its database in Synapse Core, Los Angeles. Visual effects pulls. Visual effects were in Auckland and pretty much everywhere. Client editorial submits a visual effects pull request into Synapse. Synapse orchestrates its agents in Sydney to process visual effects pulls from camera raw. Synapse delivers processed visual effects pulls to the visual effects vendors' buckets around the world. Visual effects returns. Vendors upload their completed visual effects shots to the visual effects returns bucket in Sydney. Synapse harvests the returned visual effects shots and builds its visual effects shots database. Conform and finishing. The Company 3 Cloud Studio is spun up. Client editorial uploads Conform EDL, including visual effects and non-visual effects shots, to Synapse. Synapse orchestrates its agents in Sydney to conform and process the non-visual effects shots and selectively copy visual effects shots to the Company 3 Cloud Studio in Sydney. Company 3 Cloud Studio replicates the Conform shots to US West 2 and the UK. Conform Artist verifies the Conform in the Company 3 Cloud Studio US West 2. Colorist starts a real-time collaborative DI session between US West 2, AP Southeast 2, and any other relevant locations. Participants viewing the stream are in Los Angeles, Idaho, New Zealand, and London. This was a good example, but not a singular one. Company 3, powered by AWS, has many active projects around the world.
All right, so that was a comprehensive overview of Synapse. I'm going to talk a little bit more of Synapse in context of how it was used on this show. So as we've learned, the heart of collection of metadata is the essence of Synapse driving all the downstream pipelines. Early on, Ron Ames in 2020, at the onset of the pandemic, Ron Ames called me and asked, how is this going to pan out with the onset of the pandemic? We basically had all the content in the cloud and metadata already harvested, so we didn't skip a beat, as Ron attested to that. Metadata was being harvested into the VPC that we spun up, and it was the content was being harvested from different vectors, and that allowed us to identify if there are any missing shots, and we could let the production companies know about any missing shots, and get them into the S3 buckets. In the VFX pull side of things, we were able to add any vendors to our Synapse through just a configuration change. And also, one of the advantages we had was we had all the data saved in the S3 buckets. So this allowed us to make the VFX pools available to any vendors anywhere in a very quick manner, that they could access lens grids that were pulled like 6 months or 10 months ahead previously, and get that into their buckets. That was one of the big advantages out here, and we could also add the data into the buckets in a remarkably timely manner. Moving on, the VFX returns. All the VFX, once they were completed, were accumulated into the bucket, and Synapse would go and harvest all that information. So we had awareness of all the different layers of the EXRs, as well as where it came from. So when the conform pull came in, we were able to identify which shots were VFX and non-VFX shots, and automatically move them to the conform buckets on the US West side of things. And this whole replication was also at a very high speed. So here comes the Cloud Studio part of technology. The Cloud Studio was infrastructure as code that was basically spun up in different regions very easily. And the conform artist would conform all the content that was accumulated by Synapse. And the colorist was in Idaho with Ron and his team in Auckland, and some executives in London. So we were able to do live, high quality color correction with all these teams. So the takeaways is let your imagination define your solutions. And that goes hand in hand with also, we want to understand the AWS tools available to us to build a solution so that we can focus on the creativity and let our imagination define our solutions. Thank you.